Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that highlights very interesting countries around the world through the lens of my work there, but also focusing on their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. Today, on Some Stops Along the Way, we're joined by someone whose life's work has been defined by courage, persistence, and a belief that even the most entrenched conflicts can be moved by human connection. Gershon Baskin is one of the most influential peace practitioners in the Israel Palestinian arena. He's an Israeli columnist, a social and political activist, a researcher who has spent decades studying conflict and working to build conditions for peace. In February 2025, together with Palestinian leader Samir Sinaljawi, he co-founded the Alliance for Two States, a joint Israeli-Palestinian initiative committed to preserving and advancing the possibility of a negotiated two-state solution. He also serves as the Middle East director of the International Communities Organization, a UK-based NGO working on conflict zones where peace processes have stalled or collapsed. Many of you may know him for something else, though, and that is his extraordinary facilitation of the secret back channel negotiations that led to the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit from Hamas captivity. A story he tells in his book, The Negotiator, which I've read and I would encourage all of you to do the same. And now Gershon has added another major contribution to the field. In his recent book, In Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine, it is already becoming a must-read resource for anyone committed to ending this decades-old conflict. It's a powerful blend of history, analysis, and lived experience, and it offers a roadmap for what peace could still look like. Gershon has spent his life doing work that most people say is impossible. And today he's here to help us understand what peace building looks like from the inside. The risks, the breakthroughs, the failures, and the hope that keeps him going. Gershon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a very impressive introduction. I'm blushing.
Oh well, I could have gone. I could have gone a lot further. You and I have known each other now for many years. I still remember with a lot of a lot of happiness a breakfast that we had at the Ambassador Hotel in Jerusalem. Not too long after actually Gilad Shalit, you facilitated Gilad Shalit's uh, release by Hamas. So it's been a lot of years, but I know that you've been busy on your side promoting peace. I've been busy on my side trying to work to assist U.S. allies around the world in rebuilding their economies. But here we are now on the podcast, and I'd like to get started this morning, Gershon, and with just kind of an open-ended question. You spent decades working in one of the most emotionally charged and politically complex conflicts in the world. What first pulled you into this work, and what's kept you there?
Oh, that's a really good question. I moved to Israel when I was 22 years old. I was an activist in a Zionist youth movement in the United States. I grew up at the tail end of the 1960s, and as a youngster, I was politically involved in the anti Vietnam War movement and the civil rights movement in America. Sometime when I started high school, my family moved from a town where there was a big Jewish population to a town where there was a very small Jewish population. And my first week in my new school, I was approached by another Jewish kid in my class who said that they were starting a chapter of a Zionist youth movement, which I had no idea what it meant. I didn't know anything about it. I had already visited Israel with my family for my bar mitzvah when I was 13 years old. But mainly, I joined this group because I thought it'd be a good place to meet Jewish girls. Um, that was honestly the motivation that got me in. But what I found there, as opposed to many other youth organizations, this was somewhat intellectually challenging. It dealt with issues of identity. We're talking about the beginning of the 1970s, and there was a sense for a lot of young people of alienation in the United States and at that time, in this Young Judea was the name of the movement, and they created a sense of a great appeal about the state of Israel, the ideology, the interesting nature of the country, and the challenges that it faced. I got through this Zionist education that I was going through very challenged by the idea of Israel. And by the time I was 16 and had visited Israel already another time and spent a year there after high school, I was very much attached and felt that Israel was going to be my home. But when the reality of Israel faced my own political identity, what I grew up with, being an activist against the war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement in the United States, it became very clear to me that the major challenge facing the state of Israel was the existence of another people under Israel's control within the borders that Israel conquered in the 1967 war, and a very clear sense already by 1972, 1973, that if Israel wanted to truly be the democratic nation state of the Jewish people as it defined itself, it could not be the occupier and other people denying them peace and freedom and dignity. So I got involved then. I found very early on when I met Israelis, they sort of pushed me on the side when I tried to voice an opinion on these issues, usually telling me that I didn't understand anything. I was a naive, stupid American. But then they started saying to me this sentence that I heard over and over again, and they kept saying to me, "You don't know them meaning the Arabs." Had I been smarter then, I would have asked them, "How do you know them?" To which I would have found out that they don't. They just think that they do. What they know is a bunch of stereotypes and false ideas that they've been brainwashed with all their lives. So I knew that when I moved to Israel, I had to get involved in some kind of program that would give me credibility to speak about this issue in front of Israelis. And I found out about a program that was just getting off the ground in 1978 when I finished my BA at NYU in politics and history of the Middle East. This organization that was bringing Jewish American volunteers to live in Arab villages in Israel for 2 years to engage in community work and to develop programs of interaction with nearby Jewish communities. And I joined the program. I was the first person to join the program. I spent the next 2 years living in an Arab village in Israel. And in a very short time, in fact, after 3 months of living in this village, I already knew more about the issues of Jewish-Arab relations, Israeli-Palestinian relations, than most other Jewish Israelis. That's where my career got started. I understood during those 2 years that this work is so important that it can't only be done by volunteers. It needs to be establishment oriented. It needs to be something that the state of Israel takes responsibility for. My next jump in my career was convincing the government of Israel to hire me, and I became the first civil servant in Israel responsible for Jewish-Arab relations, created a department in the Ministry of Education, and so on. I think I should jump in here and just note that while I immigrated to Israel in 1978 at the age of 22 as a graduate of a Zionist youth movement. For years now, I have not been able to call myself a Zionist. And the reason for that is that most everything that's done in the name of Zionism in the state of Israel are things that I'm opposed to, including occupying the Palestinian people, building settlements, expelling Palestinians from their home, waging a massive war in Gaza that lasted many, many more months than it should have, and etc. So I define myself an Israeli. This is my home. I've lived here my whole adult life, going on 48 years now. I got married here to a native Israeli. I have 3 native-born Israeli children, 1 native-born Israeli granddaughter. So this is my home. And it's extraordinarily challenging and difficult looking at the reality of Israel and asking myself, more my children ask me all the time, how much longer are we going to be able to stay in this home into which we were born and grew up in, when Israel continues to do such horrible things and stands for almost everything that we don't believe in. And this is one of the big challenges of living here. And this is one of the things that makes me committed to working for peace, because if Israel fails to make peace with our Palestinian neighbors, Israel will lose its ability to claim that it is the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, a state that provides equality for all of its citizens. 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian Arabs. They don't have equality here. And of course, the Israeli Palestinian conflict just keeps getting worse and worse
Right.
with its manifestations of the continuation of the occupation. And of course, what went on in Gaza over the last 2 years.
Right. And this brings me to another point. Many of my listeners will know certainly something about all of the issues relative to Israel and Palestine. And as you know, there are very entrenched positions on both sides. But for those who may not fully understand how we got to this point, could you just briefly outline what laid the groundwork for the situation that Israel and Palestine finds themselves in today?
Here we get into the dirty water of narratives because there are different narratives on what happened here. There is the Jewish Zionist narrative, which is largely supported by countries like the United States, which says that following the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were exterminated by the Nazis, it became clear that the creation of the State of Israel for the Jewish people was a moral imperative. And the newly formed United Nations voted on the partition of Palestine, which had been under a British mandate since 1920 or 21, that the land of Palestine would be divided into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Um, the population at the time of Palestine had a very large majority of Palestinian Arabs, a minority of Jews, but the Jews who remained in Europe after the Holocaust needed a place to go to. And the international community, through the newly formed UN, decided to grant the Jews a state through the partition plan. The partition plan was reluctantly accepted by the Jewish community in Palestine because there was no alternative, even though they were only given about half of the land and they wanted it all. The Palestinian Arab community and its leadership did not support the partition plan, and the Arab states surrounding Israel did not support the partition plan. And on May 15th, 1948, when the British up and left, the official war, which the Israelis called the War of Independence and the Palestinians called the Nakba, the catastrophe, unfolded. And at the end of the war, rather than Israel holding 50+% of the land, it conquered 78% of the land. About 700,000 to 800,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees in the surrounding Arab countries and abroad, and the state of Israel was born. Um, there was another war in 1956 and another war in 1967. And the war in 1967, where Israel felt itself being strangled by Egypt and Syria, launched a preemptive strike on June 5th, 1967, and ended up at the end of the war conquering all the West Bank, the Golan Heights of Syria, and the Sinai Desert of Egypt, seriously expanding the border and also occupying all of Palestine, the land of Palestine, the land of Israel, during which time the territories occupied by Israel, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, fell under Israeli control. And unlike the Palestinian Arabs who were in Israel at the end of the 1948 war, in 1949, got citizenship, the Palestinian Arabs in the territories occupied by Israel in 67 were kept under occupation, a military occupation, and that military occupation exists until today, since 1967, with periodic wars, with periodic peace processes along the way. The most notable is the Oslo peace process, which began in 1993 and actually led to the creation of a Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be an interim agreement for 5 years, during which time Israel and the Palestinians would negotiate a permanent status deal that most people believed would lead to a two-state solution, where there'd be a free Palestinian state, sovereign state next to Israel. But that peace process failed, and it basically ended with a lot of violence and a lot of death. It led to another intifada, another Palestinian uprising, which was very bloody.
Mm-hmm.
It eventually led to Hamas taking over the territory by elections in 2006, and the territory is being divided between the West Bank and Gaza because the West Bank continued to be controlled by the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, and Gaza being controlled by Hamas. And Gaza controlled Hamas lasted until October 7th, when Hamas launched its brutal, savage attack against the state of Israel. For reasons yet unresearched, but basically known, Israel did not defend its border in the south on October 7th of 2023, and Hamas managed to conquer Israeli communities along that border for a period of up to a week. 1,200 Israelis were killed, 251 were taken as hostage into Gaza, including women and children and elderly people, including dead bodies were taken as hostages. And subsequently, Israel launched a war against Gaza, which has destroyed Gaza. And the final number of people killed in Gaza over the 2 years of war will probably reach 100,000. And Gaza is totally destroyed. Israel committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and incredible cases of acts of genocide that took place over the last 2 years. It ended because President Trump finally decided that it had to end, and he forced an end on Israel. And now we're in a new stage, a new period, a new chapter with the Trump plan coming into place, and we can talk much more in detail about that.
So this this description is really fascinating for those of us who have worked in this region and studied in the region and studied the region. It is still almost unbelievable to understand all of the machinations that have come into play and all the complexity of this situation. I know you have friends on both sides, and which is what made you the perfect back channel facilitator for the Gilad Shalit issue, which we'll get into later. But how do you navigate walk this fine line between the friends that you have on both sides and both of these communities that have very different ideas of what peace looks like? How do you navigate that?
No, in 1988, in the fourth month of the first Intifada, um, I was waiting since the mid 70s for the period of time when I recognized that the mainstream Palestinian political leadership would be talking about a two-state solution. In other words, recognizing perhaps not the legitimacy of the existence of Israel, but recognizing the existence of Israel. In other words, the Palestinian national movement defining that their ultimate goal was no longer the destruction of Israel, but finding a way of creating liberation and self-determination in a state that would be next to Israel, not in place of Israel. That happened during the first Intifada, when the young leadership that started this uprising in the refugee camps of the West Bank and Gaza were putting out political leaflets expressing a new political ambition, which was to create an independent Palestinian state next to Israel. At that time, I quit the work that I was doing, running an institute for Jewish Arab coexistence within the state of Israel between Jewish and Arab citizens, and created a joint Israeli Palestinian public policy think tank and do tank, as we called it, called IPCRI, the Israel Palestine Center for Research and Information. What was unique about IPCRI was not only that it was a joint Israeli Palestinian institution run with total equality between the Israeli Jewish and Palestinian Arab leadership in every level of management of this institution, but what was also unique is that we started our work from the two-state solution. We said we're not going to argue about the rights of both peoples to self-determination and to have a state of their own living in peace next to each other. And the work that we would engage in is kind of backwards engineering. This is where we want to get to. We're not arguing about that. Let's figure out how to do that. And that enabled me to bring together groups of mainstream Israelis and Palestinians from as early as 1988 to sit around a table in a safe environment where they knew they could talk freely and they wouldn't be questioned and they wouldn't see their names in the newspaper. And we started with working on economic issues, on the future of Jerusalem, and on water and environmental issues. And over 24 years that I co-directed that institute, we convened more than 2,000 working groups of Israelis and Palestinians working on this issue of how do we create a two-state solution. Um, the fact that we started from the point where we recognize the collective legitimacy, the collective national legitimacy of both people, enabled me to develop the kind of contacts on both sides with leadership at every level of society, with professionals from the universities and academic institutions. Um, it became an institution that people wanted to participate in because it was one of the few places where you could have an honest discussion about how to resolve the conflict, looking at issues, not talking generally, but all these working groups were professionals working on issues that concern them, whether it be healthcare or border security or economic development or links between businesses or water experts, environmental. We did it all. Every issue that was concerning the Israeli-Palestinian relationship over 24 years, we worked on. And that gave me the credibility over the years to also engage in secret back channel negotiations, which I've been doing until this day. I played a key role in the negotiations, assisting the American side in its relations with Hamas to end the war in Gaza and release the hostages. I must say, over the last years, it's been more and more difficult to deal with the Israeli side, as the Israeli side has become more extreme and more right wing, and less relevant actually in terms of determining the immediate future, because for the first time in the history of this conflict, we have a president in the United States who can actually tell Israel what to do, and Israel can't say no. This is a new dynamic, which makes my relationship with the American negotiators, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, other people who are working with the team there, whether it be Tony Blair or Nikolai Mladenov or other people who are working on the Board of Peace or the Executive Committee or even now the new Gaza government. These are people that I've known over the years and have a trusting, open relationship with, and it makes it very, very important to be able to talk to people openly, honestly, and at most times secretly.
Very, very interesting indeed. And we're going to circle back to this most recent um, iteration of the peace discussions in Israel and Palestine through the quote unquote Trump plan. But I want to make a statement here and get your reaction to it. I did an interview not long ago, and I've said before that this is such a complex issue when we talk about the relationship of Israel and Palestine. It's like peeling back an onion. There are so many layers to it. I've said in the past that both sides are right in their positions about peace, and both sides are wrong. Do you agree with that statement? And what are some of the key issues on both sides that are the red lines or the biggest hurdles to addressing
I,
peace?
I I think you're right, Mark. It is complex at times, and it is kind of an onion that you keep peeling away and getting to the core issues. But on another level, and this is something I said to a group of 50 pre-army kids yesterday in Israel, um, in a lot of ways, this conflict is not so complex. It's really about a very simple equation. And the equation is the following: Israel will never have security if the Palestinians don't have freedom. The Palestinians will never have freedom if Israel doesn't have security. That's the bottom line here. If we want to reach peace, the two sides have to understand that this equation between Israeli security and Palestinian freedom is what it's all about. You can get into the issues of where you draw the borderline. You can get into the issues of land ownership. You can get into the very sensitive issue of Palestinian refugee rights, or the core, the center of the onion is the city of Jerusalem. And the core of the core is the old city of Jerusalem, which is less than 1 square mile of
Right.
territory. And that's the heart of this conflict. And of course, you need to resolve Jerusalem and borders and settlements and refugees, and work out issues of security and economic development. I tell one of the Israeli students said to me yesterday, why should we give the Palestinians a state? And I said, we're not going to give them a state. They're going to create their own state. What Israel needs to do is get out of their hair. Israel needs to allow them to have the freedom that they have a right to. And in exchange, the Palestinians have to understand that the Palestinian state cannot exist if it's going to be a basis for terrorism against Israel. If Israelis are going to get killed as a result of Palestinians having a state, then the Palestinians are not going to have a state. So it's only when the Palestinian national movement determines that there is no longer a viable armed struggle against the state of Israel. Palestinians will tell me that we have a right to use arms against the Israeli occupation. And I will tell them, yes, by international law, you have a right to use arms against a military occupation. Now, I want to ask you, for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, you've been doing this armed struggle. What have you achieved? Do you have your state? Do you have your freedom? It's not a question of what you have the right to do. It's about time that we begin to ask ourselves, what's the smart thing to do? How are we going to achieve security for Israel and freedom for the Palestinians that's going to enable us to live in a peaceful two-state solution?
Right. Very, very good points. I've heard several pundits discussing many of the issues they see as blockages to peace, and they tend to focus on ideology, religion, history. But recently, I've heard some say that there, and I know that you believe that there can be peace in Israel and Palestine. That is what your new book is all about. But I've heard some say that there'll never be peace among the Israelis and the Palestinians because there's too much money and power associated with war. How do you
That's a
feel
very
about
good point. There is a lot of corruption here, and certainly the military is a big part of the Israeli economy. And we know that the Israeli military industries are now selling their goods all over the world as field tested, where they show films of how Israeli weapon systems were used in Gaza over the last 2 years, some of them committing war crimes, but they're used to sell these weapons. I think that um, it is a big obstacle to peace, but the potential profit, if we're talking simply at the economic level, the potential profit of a peaceful region is so much greater for both people than what the arms industries make. Even the American arm industries, we know that the American support for Israel is basically transferred from one American pocket to another American pocket because the money is used to buy weapon systems in the United States, the most sophisticated weapon systems that exist. Israel needs to be strong. Israel needs to have a strong army because part of its existence is based on its projection of power.
right?
Certainly, when there's still elements in the region, Iran and others that would like to destroy Israel. But a strong Israel needs to also make peace with the Palestinians. There's no question in my mind that the Israeli economy would boom in a peaceful era, eh, particularly in the region. We now have, the Middle East region is very different than it was 20, 30 years ago. Israel should want to be part of the region. We have peace with some of the countries. The peace with the United Arab Emirates and Israel, which is only a few years old, has produced enormous economic benefits for both sides. Incredible. Imagine what would happen to the Israeli economy and the Palestinian economy if Israel had peace with Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
It's unbelievable what the potential is for peace and economics.
Right. And let's circle back now, continuing that theme to this Trump negotiated um, plan. How is it different than those that came before with Carter, Begin, Arafat? Uh, and do you think that this is a a real path, or is this just a another iteration that you believe will lead to a dead end?
First of all, the past 2 years and 4 months have been the worst 2 years and 4 months of the Israeli and Palestinian people in the history of this country and this conflict. We have suffered greater losses and experienced greater trauma than ever before. For the Jewish people in Israel, what happened on October 7th was the worst thing that happened since the Holocaust. And for the Palestinian people, I believe that the last 2 years and 4 months have been worse than the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. So we're facing two very traumatized people. And the primary lesson that we Israelis and Palestinians need to learn is that we can't keep doing this. We have to stop. We have to find another way. We can't keep going to war because it's too costly in human lives, in human suffering. Eh, What's different now with President Trump from every other prior president dealing with this conflict is that it's the first time that, as I said before, that the Israeli prime minister cannot say no to the US president.
Right.
And that's very different. It's also the first time that the president's envoy to the region, um, who has generally often been an American Jew, like Steve Witkoff is an American Jew, but Witkoff is a very different element than everything we've known before, because almost every other US presidential envoy to the region or to the peace process was very Israel focused. Witkoff has grown to have a special relationship with the Israelis, but his initial business interest in the region were in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. And his friends in the region were in Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. They were not so developed in Israel. Israel is very new for him. And that also gives a much wider perspective on the potentials, on the allies, on what it needs to take to make peace here. And this is very important because for most of the past years, the Israeli Palestinian peace process was bilateral, Israel and Palestine. And the failure of the peace process over the years was largely based on the fact that it was bilateral.
Mhm.
Because in a bilateral situation, Israel has a veto on everything, and Israel used its veto. And in general, the relationship between Israel and the United States basically got the United States to act on behalf of Israel in negotiations. I used to say that the President Clinton and others served as the Attorney General for Israel during negotiations with the Palestinians. But when you transform this into a regional discussion, we're expanding the pie, as we say in negotiation theory. We're talking about regional security alliances. And here it's very interesting because during the years of the war, when Israel is attacked twice by Iran, who shot down the Iranian missiles? It was Jordan and Egypt and the Emirates and the Saudis and the Americans and the Israelis. There was essentially a unified defense pact that grew up overnight without negotiations and without signed agreements. But it's a reflection of the new reality that exists in the Middle East, partly because of the Abraham Accords that were done by Trump in his first term in office, and largely because the dynamics of the region have changed after the Arab Spring, after the rise of Hezbollah and ISIS and Iran's threat to the region. Um, so when we look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the context of a regional agreement, where we're talking about regional security pacts, we're talking about regional economic development, we're talking about enabling the Palestinian economy to grow rapidly, to improve the lives of Palestinians, where they're not solely dependent on the obstacles put there by Israel, and a reality in which there might be conflicts of interest between the US president and the state of Israel. We already saw that emerging this week, where the Americans have forced Israel to agree to the reopening of the Rafah crossing that goes from Gaza to Egypt. Now, Israel is going to have a great deal of control then, is still, because it managed to convince the Americans to allow them to have control. But I don't think that's going to last. I think that the reality on the ground, when it becomes clear to the American side that the primary obstacle to the reconstruction of Gaza is going to be Israel, and the Americans have a vision of what needs to happen in Gaza, I think there are going to be more conflicts between Trump and Netanyahu.
Mhm.
And hopefully that will lead also sometime in 2026, when we hold new elections in Israel, that Netanyahu will not be reelected.
So you mentioned the Iranians a moment ago, and the coalition on the Israeli side that has banded together, if you will, um, to provide security. Talk a little bit about how the relationship between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority impacts the ability for there to be peace. How did October 7th impact the Palestinian Authority for the
Well, it impacted it in an enormous way. That in fact, the Palestinian Authority was irrelevant with regard to the war in Gaza. In fact, the Palestinian president, who's 90 years old and in the 22nd year of a 4-year term, enjoys zero legitimacy on the Palestinian street. And his lack of ability to change what happened in Gaza became even more apparent when the Americans decided, together with consultations with the other Arab states, who is going to be the technocratic non-Hamas government of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority doesn't have control there. Now, some of the Arab countries are concerned about that, and they built in mechanisms so that there won't be two separate Palestinian governments forever. Uh, but as a result of what happened in Gaza and the result of the loss of legitimacy of Mahmoud Abbas, which is also largely because of Israel refusing to negotiate with him, of Israel determining, as one of our ministers said, Smutrich, our Minister of Finance, said that the Palestinian Authority is a liability and Hamas is an asset, in thinking that the existence of a divided Palestinian government with a group like Hamas ruling half the Palestinian territory enables Israel not to be forced to negotiate peace with the Palestinians. This is, in the right-wing view of Israel, an asset. But the Palestinian Authority greatly facilitated that perception because it became a corrupted body, which on the one hand cooperates with Israeli security, often putting them in a position in the eyes of Palestinians of collaborators with the occupation, of subcontractors of the occupation. But it has now also forced Mahmoud Abbas, in a commitment that he undertook to Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and French President Emmanuel Macron, which was brought to the United Nations General Assembly as a resolution where they are engaging in reforms in the Palestinian Authority. They stopped the pay to slay policies of paying families of Palestinian terrorists who were killed by Israel or sitting in Israeli prisons. They are engaging in educational reform. Mahmoud Abbas signed a decree just yesterday saying that the municipal elections that are taking place in the West Bank in the end of May, political parties that don't support the PLO line of a two-state solution, of peace with Israel, are not going to be allowed to participate in the elections. This is basically saying that Hamas is no longer a political factor that can compete in democratic elections. And it's completely legitimate for a democratic or an attempted democratic entity to protect itself. Because we know that Hamas wanted elections back in 2006, but Hamas wanted elections only once.
Right.
And that's often a lot of different parties that claim to use democracy and then kill democracy, like Hamas did in Gaza. So there's a new reality. It's also in the aftermath of the war in Gaza. Hamas is no longer a viable entity in Gaza. At least 90% of the Gazans never want to see Hamas again. It's very important to note that the Gazans blame Israel for all the death and destruction, but they hold Hamas responsible.
Right.
Hamas brought them to the situation that Israel did what all it did. And we're not in a situation of forgive and forget. Everyone's going to remember and not forget for a very long time. But the
Right.
people of Gaza don't want to see Hamas anymore.
Yes.
Israel killed all the Hamas leadership in Gaza,
Yeah.
the political leadership and the military leadership. So Hamas can hold on as long as a vacuum of alternative leadership, but they have no real control or power to govern Gaza or the West Bank ever again.
This reminds me of a conversation I had with our project driver, Palestinian guy back when I was working in Ramallah, and who we were actually in Hebron that day, and there were a few things going on as there usually are in Hebron, and I made the statement: "Explain to me how this works." Uh, someone on the Palestinian side injures or kills two or three Israelis. You know what the Israeli response is going to be. It's going to be disproportionate, right?
Of
Uh,
course,
and so how does this conflict ever work in your favor? And you know what one of the big elements here that people have talked about for years now is the influence of Iran. Some have said Iran's the head of the snake. If you cut off the head of the snake, then you cut off the funding to Hamas. You stabilize the region, and that takes care of the issue. Obviously, many of us who have worked there know it's not that simple. But where does Iran fit into this whole equation? Is neutralizing Iran's influence, either politically or militarily, is that going to be part and parcel of some type of bringing the Palestinians and the Israelis to the table to work for peace?
yeah, I'll touch on Iran in a moment. I just want to mention something about the finance of terrorism and finance of Hamas. Hamas was largely supported by Iran when it was first founded during the First Intifada, but after the Arab Spring, when Hamas broke with Syria and went from Syria to Egypt at the time when the Muslim Brotherhood was elected in Egypt, they broke their ties with Iran. And since 2012 until today, they've been working on patching up those ties with Iran. But Hamas is a brilliant business operation. They have a massive amount of money that they've raised through crypto charities and businesses that they launched all around the world, often getting money from Muslim charities that don't know that they're contributing to terrorism, but they've raised billions of dollars, plus all the hundreds of millions of dollars that they got from Qatar over the years that was facilitated by Israel. Iran is a big problem. It's a big problem for Israel. It's a big problem for the United States. It's a problem for the region. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, they're all threatened by Iran. And Iran was a much bigger threat to Israel when Hezbollah was the major player and controlled Lebanon. But since the war in Gaza began, we see a new Syria developing with a new regime there, which is anti Iran. The government of Lebanon, for the first time in decades, is trying to recreate Lebanese sovereignty, where the government of Lebanon is in charge. The president of Lebanon is always a Christian, and the current president, was a general in the Lebanese army, and the prime minister, who's a Sunni Muslim, was someone who was a justice in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It's a completely different new reality. And with the help of the Americans and the French and the British and others, Lebanon is in the process of diminishing the role and importance of Hezbollah and the ability of Hezbollah to control Lebanon, which is an outgrowth of the war as well. So Iran's proxies today have been cut off largely. They still have their proxies in Yemen, the Houthis, and there's a war taking place in Yemen. Unfortunately, this war pits the Saudis and the Emiratis against each other because they've each supported different groups in Yemen. And now we'll see what's happening now with the whole American war machine facing Iran, whether or not President Trump is going to use military might for what he promised the Iranian people against the Iranian regime, or whether or not the Americans are going to go into a negotiated process, hopefully not, with the Iranian regime, because it will strengthen it. A tactical war against the regime, which is very difficult to wage, that would weaken the regime further than it's weakened. Some people, experts, are saying that the regime of the Ayatollahs in Iran now is at their weakest point since the revolution in 1979. So it might be the opportune time to use cyber warfare and other means of furthering weakening the regime. The main problem in Iran today is their economy, which is a failed economy. The city of Tehran doesn't have water. They're talking about moving the capital to another place because there's a water crisis there. These are the kind of things that could bring about a regime change in Iran, and hopefully they will.
Right.
And Iran is a problem. But as I commented a lot lately, it's not at the base of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They're
Right.
completely different issues.
Right. That's the point that I wanted. I'm glad you brought out, because a lot of people think that this is a one-dimensional solution. You take care of Iran, you take care of the problem, and we know, of course,
Yeah,
that
it's not that simple.
that's not the case.
Yeah.
I want to pivot back to your new book, and it's not so new now. I think it's been out for a while, but In Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine. You've been doing this for a long time. You've been involved in some of the trickiest negotiations, back channel and otherwise. And in the book, you talk about some frustrations and disappointments that you've had in working for peace. Is there a time that you came to the breaking point? Is there a time that you said, maybe this isn't going to happen and it's just not worth it? And how did you get past that and move forward?
Yeah, I allow myself very short periods, 24 hours, 48 hours, to seep into depression. And I don't allow it to go on, and it's very much mind controlled. I can wake up in the morning and feel this is hopeless, and 24 hours later I'll have a new idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as we say here, what's the word in English? I can't remember the word in English now, but not having a plan is not a plan. Being
Right.
depressed is not a plan. You got to have a plan. You got to have something to do. And every day I have something, some new idea, some new way of working, some new contact, some person that I've been working with that I can try to impress and get to be on my side and support what I'm trying to do. The most frustrating periods that I've gone through, and actually what broke me, it was the whole issue of finance, of fundraising. I've fundraised for 40 years. I couldn't do it anymore. When I left IPCRI after 24 years, it wasn't the work that broke me down. It wasn't the frustration of sitting in so many discussions of Israelis and Palestinians, thinking that no new ideas were coming out of these meetings except the ones I put on the table. It was the fact that every morning I had to wake up and figure out how am I going to pay the salaries of the people who are working for me? How am I going to pay the rent? How am I going to pay for the activities that I want to do? And it got to a point where I found myself having to generate programs which were donor directed.
Right.
Rather than doing what I wanted to do, what I thought we needed to do, in order to survive organizationally, I had to give the donors what they wanted to do that I often thought was irrelevant or stupid or a waste of time. And when it got to that point, I couldn't do it anymore. So after 24 years, I also thought it was the right time to leave, to turn it over to the next generation, to
Right.
bring in new people and new ideas and new energy. Unfortunately, the people who took over IPCRI from me 10 years later collapsed it. They
Oh.
didn't have the stamina. They didn't have the ability to go on. They didn't have the determination. Um, and it's very unfortunate that an institution that was such an important thing at its time no longer exists today. And the most tragic thing is that the person who was in charge of it, the director, lost the website. So the website, which was an archive of material, I just recently paid someone. I bought a new website. The people who stole our name, ipcri.org, offered to sell it to me for like $100,000.
Oh.
It was crazy. So I got ipcrinew.org or something like that and paid
Right.
someone to rebuild the website. So hopefully there will
Right.
be some historical record of what existed for more than 30 years of work.
And that's a really important point because this business takes a lot out of you. Not just the peace building aspect, but just the organizational aspect and having to work with donors. And of course, as an implementing partner, uh, we were hired to implement projects, some of which had elements in it that we knew didn't make sense, but we were hired to do a job, and that's something you have to either come to grips with or walk away from, as you did. But Gershon, are there some things that you look as you look back in your early years in trying to promote peace? Are there things that you believed then that you no longer believe? How has your approach and your mindset changed?
I think that the basics remain the same. The foundation is the same. The principles are the same. Um, the element of demonstrating the humanity of each side to the other side has remained the same. The element of dealing with the conflict as a problem solving initiative. In other words, take on a problem and solve it, figure out how to do it, provide options to decision makers. um, what has changed is the political reality on the ground. There's at one time there were political leaders who you could talk to, who you could influence, who could maybe direct in the right way. We don't have them today. Israel and Palestine need new leaders, and it's very difficult when you look at what's available on the political arena on both sides to imagine that there will be a leadership in the coming year that will be very different than the current leadership. I'm hopeful that new generations of leaders who will not forgive and forget, but will enable at least to look forward. We have leaders that only look backwards. And that's a terrible thing because we have a very bad history. And if you base your future only on your history, we're not going to get anywhere. We're just going to keep repeating what we've been doing, which is the wrong way to go about it. What has changed for me at a personal level is that I have a much higher level of influence that I've ever had. I wish I had this influence 20, 30 years ago, but that took a lot of decades to build. I have access to the highest levels of people around the world. I work directly with Steve Witkoff and with Jared Kushner, and I can reach them at any time of the day, every day. I never had that in the past. Something about my name, my reputation, the work that I've done over the years has enabled that to happen. The other thing, which is very different for me today than in the past, is I'm now working with a Palestinian, who you mentioned his name before, Samer Sinjalawi. In the 47, 48 years that I've been doing this work, I've never worked with a Palestinian where we were so much of the same mindset, the same values, the same work ethic. In fact, it amazes me at times because in the past, when I took full responsibility for doing everything, administration and everything, because I knew if I didn't do it, it was going to get done, Samer always beats me to take care of what needs to be done. And for me, at my age, at doing this work, it's nice to have someone else who takes responsibility and does it. Doesn't ask questions, doesn't say who's going to do it. He just does it. And it's a real pleasure. And I wish I worked with Samer for the past 47 years. We would have achieved so much more had we been a partnership so strong as we are today.
Right, right. And let's circle back now, Gershon, to your back channel negotiations to gain the freedom of Gilad Shalit. I believe, if my memory serves correct, that Gilad was captured by Hamas in 2006. Is that correct?
That's right. In the end of June 2006.
And it took until 2011 for
That's
him
right.
to be released. In your book, The Negotiator, you outline a lot of the peaks and valleys, how you got involved in those negotiations, a lot of the peaks and valleys. Um, but I think the question that I had after reading the book more than once is, how did you have the patience and the staying power to see it through? Because there were times it appeared that it was totally unraveling.
It was so hopeless for so many years. It's important to recognize, even after the tragic reality of the last 2 years, where we had 251 hostages in Gaza, Gilad Shalit was in captivity for 5 years and 4 months. He is the Israeli who spent more time in captivity than any other Israeli alive. And the tragedy of Gilad Shalit is that the deal that was eventually done in 2011 was on the table in December 2006. More or less the same deal. But there was no willingness on the Israeli side to accept it at that time. It took 5 years more until the Israeli government was willing to accept it. What kept me there, and I write this in the book, is that in September of 2005, one of my wife's first cousins was kidnapped and murdered by Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
And when he disappeared, members of the family asked me to use my contacts in the Palestinian side to try and find him, and I tried and failed. Didn't produce anything. Hamas then produced a videotape of him after he'd been tortured and blindfolded and handcuffed. And he was an Iraqi Jew, so he spoke Arabic. And in Arabic, he said that if Israel releases Palestinian prisoners, he would be freed. But several days later, the Israeli security was on their tails, and his captors decided to murder him with a butcher's knife. They threw his body on the side of the road. And at his funeral, which was attended by more than 1,000 Israelis, most who didn't know him, I stood over his grave. His name was Sasson. And I stood over his grave, crying like every other member of the family. And I felt particularly bad because here I've been working with Palestinians for decades, and the family asked me to try and save his life, and I failed. And I swore to myself over Sasson's grave that if ever again I'm approached by someone to save a human life, I'll do everything possible. So for the 5 years and 4 months that Gilad Shalit was in captivity, I got engaged actually a week after he was abducted, because I had been trying to foster a dialogue between Hamas academics and Israeli academics.
Mm-hmm.
That brought me into direct contact with the Hamas leadership, which never happened because the Hamas leadership vetoed it. But I went to Gaza. I was in the Hamas prime minister's office. I was in the Islamic University, met with these Hamas people. Um, every time I got depressed and felt it was hopeless, I thought about Sasson. And in fact, in 2014, two Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza and their bodies were taken hostage. In the same year, and I found out about this in 2015, two Israeli civilians who, both mentally not well, had crossed into Gaza and were captured by Hamas. So there were four Israelis, two dead, two alive, in Gaza. For a period of 8 years, I tried to negotiate with Hamas their release. I did it directly with the Israeli government responsible for the hostages. And then after October 7th, immediately from the first week, I got involved in trying to negotiate with Hamas the release of hostages, which became eventually, even after day 100 of the war, that it was a negotiation to end the war, not just to release the hostages. And I tell people that, we've all been traumatized. My trauma has not been psychological, but it has been physical. I didn't have a full night's sleep in 2 years. I would wake up every night thinking about the hostages in Gaza, thinking about the death and destruction of people in Gaza that I know, of Palestinians in Gaza. And, the last remaining hostage was a deceased hostage, just came back the day before yesterday, and his funeral was today. And it's the end of a chapter. Um, we're at the beginning of a new chapter, but this is Sasson has been part of my determination to end this, because it was someone close that I tried to save and failed.
What a great backstory that is, and a great motivation for you to become involved. There are now no Israeli hostages in Palestine as of
For
today,
the
correct?
for the first time since 2014.
Right, right. And so, when I was there, Gershon, as you know, we were working on a project called West Bank Trade. That's the last time that I was there, and we were trying to promote trade between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Again, this was a project that was designed by USAID with good intentions, but do you believe that such trade is possible, and that there is an economic component to the peace process as well, meaning that um, can at least part of the process of peace be improving the economic livelihoods of the Palestinians enough where they focus on increasing their own livelihoods versus um, the feeling of hopelessness has led them to this situation.
Right. No, definitely, yes. Even in the face of the reality today, we talk about increasing trade. In the reality where the West Bank is largely cut off from the world and Gaza has been cut off for 20 years, um, 85% of what Palestinians produce in the West Bank is sold to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
65% of what the Palestinians import, they buy from Israel. So there's quite a bit of trade, but the numbers are very small.
Right.
And the numbers are very small because of the Israeli obstacles to Palestinian economic development. From the very simple reality that Palestinians don't have any control of external borders. So, according to the economic agreement between Israel and the PLO from 1994, Israel collects all tax revenues on behalf of the Palestinians' customs, and there's an exchange of VAT. But the Israeli side, which holds the power and holds the money, owes the Palestinian Authority more than $3 billion worth of tax collection that for the last 2 years has not transferred to the Palestinians. Um, the Palestinian banks deal primarily with the Israeli shekel. There are 13 Palestinian banks registered in Palestine. The banks collectively are sitting on more than 15 billion shekels in cash money that the Israeli bank, central bank, guided by the Israeli Minister of Finance, who's the leader of the Israeli settler movement, refuses to allow the Palestinians to transfer the cash back to Israel, except for a quota of the money, which means that the Palestinians are sitting on paper that they can't use. Because even when they buy products from Israel, it's done with digital currency, it's not done with cash. It's not cash on order. When companies in the West Bank buy raw products for their factories, they have to send a bank wire. They can't do it because they're holding on cash that's Israel does. So there are more than 900 checkpoints closing off every Palestinian community today. I was in Ramallah a month ago to do an interview on a Saudi television station. My taxi had to wait at a checkpoint for more than an hour to get out of Ramallah. If you travel from Ramallah to Nablus, which on a normal day should take an hour, it will take 6 hours today.
right,
So, what needs to happen to enable Palestinians who are brilliant business people and
right,
face the reality they have managed to survive all these years with all the Israeli obstacles? If they could just remove the Israeli obstacles, the economy would boom. 200,000 Palestinians who worked in Israel before October 7, 2023, have not been allowed to work in Israel anymore. Their jobs have been taken from them. And there's deep poverty in the West Bank today. And you look at why hasn't the West Bank exploded like Gaza did? The reason is because people in the West Bank see Gaza, which is totally destroyed, and they don't want their communities destroyed. There is a kind of deterrence that Israel built now as a result of the massive destruction of Gaza, but it's not sustainable. People are hungry. People don't have work. The
right,
young people have no hope. As opposed to Gaza, the young people in Gaza in the West Bank can still leave, but there are many places for them to go that will accept them. So it's really an unsustainable situation now, and economy is a big part of it. You can't buy Palestinian peace with the economy. You
right,
couldn't give all the money in the world to the Israelis to not declare their state in 1948, and you can't buy the Palestinian aspiration for freedom and liberation either. But building the economy, I said to this group of young Israelis yesterday, it makes no sense whatsoever for Israel to want to have poor neighbors.
right,
Poor neighbors are bad neighbors. We should want to have happy neighbors.
right, right. Agreed. So we could go on for another hour or two just talking about all of these issues, but in kind of bringing this to a natural conclusion for this episode, after everything you've witnessed, Gershon, over your career, what does peace look like to you now? Not as a policy, but as a lived reality. What does it look like?
Well, it is what I say to people as I live in peace. I personally, Gershon, I went for my brother lives here and we haven't seen each other lately, so we started deciding that once a week we're going to go to a restaurant, and the restaurants that I've picked have been on the Palestinian side of Jerusalem. We were just in the Palestinian side of Jerusalem. We had lunch in a great Palestinian restaurant, went to a Palestinian supermarket afterwards, and for me I feel totally natural there. Most other Israelis walking around there would be scared.
Right,
I felt at home. I also speak Arabic. I can get by in Arabic, and there was nothing unnatural for me to be on the Palestinian side of East Jerusalem. That's for me what peace means when people meet, where it's not you're the Israeli and I'm the Palestinian and there are walls and fences between us, but we actually have much more in common than we have in different,
right,
and we could benefit so much more by knowing each other. We could benefit so much more by speaking each other's language. It makes no sense that Israelis and Palestinians don't learn each other's language, particularly because Hebrew and Arabic are sister languages. There's so much in common between them. And it just doesn't make sense that we're willing to fight and to kill and to die to preserve something which we don't have to. We can have it and live in peace.
I've said for a long time that you can do as much or more over a dinner table as you can a negotiating table, and just getting to know each other and understanding each other and spending time with each other is critically important. I too always stayed in the Palestinian area of East Jerusalem during the time that I worked in Israel and Palestine, and it's a very comfortable, pleasant place with so many good people
Yeah.
that are really caring and hospitable, etc. And it's regrettable that many Israelis and many internationals never get to see that. So, bringing this to a close, Gershon, one final thing: what gives you the confidence to keep going?
Um, I was always asked throughout my life, are we going to see peace in your lifetime? And my answer remains yes. I'm not a young man anymore. I'm 69 years old, and I still think it can be done in my lifetime. Because we know how to do it. We know what needs to be done. And if we simply had more willingness of leaders or people who call themselves leaders to take the risks of reaching out to the other side on both sides, we can do this. We also now have a new political reality, which is Trump.
Right.
which, and I'm not a Trump supporter, and I didn't vote for him. And I have lots of questions about a lot of things that he's trying to do, but he actually saved us,
Right.
and he might actually be the person who could bring us to peace.
Right. Right. That in itself could spawn a whole another hour of
I know
discussion.
I could spend an hour talking about all the reasons why what I just said is crazy.
But you know, uh, you and I, since we last saw each other, we got some more gray in our hair. Your hair is still hanging along, mine not so much. But our approach and our belief is still the same. That this is a struggle worth having, and that on both sides of the equation, there needs to be more understanding. There needs to be more dialogue. There needs to be more tolerance. And I personally am glad that you're out there working on this. I want to remind the readers Gershon's book, his new book on the prospects for peace in Israel and Palestine and the negotiator are available on Amazon, as is my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which has a chapter that talks about my time in the region as well and touches on some of the issues that Gershon and I did today. So we'll stop it right here. Gershon, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
I really appreciate you being on the show today. And for all of you listeners, join us next time on Some Stops Along the Way. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you.